we have it in our heads that when we buy something, it's our responsibility forever thereafter. And that really lets manufacturers entirely off the hook for everything thereafter. And you have some notions that can expand our way of thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting cultural thing that we've taken on too, or maybe have been marketed to believe very strategically. But yeah, I think in general, past the point of sale, the company sells something to us and we take it home. After that, it's ours. And that means it's ours to take care of in our homes. It's ours to dispose of. It's the public's to dispose of in terms of landfill, incineration, et cetera. Like it really becomes like public property a little bit after the individual's done using it. And it's really interesting that that has happened in that way, that ownership has been so fully transferred, because so much of what you can do with something at the end of its life is actually a design decision. It's what materials it's made out of. It's how it's constructed. Is it recyclable? Is it toxic? Even things just like knowing the local recycling laws. But all of that is like a design decision that manufacturers could spend time with to think about taking back that product and breaking it down and reusing it. Or how is the end consumer, how long are they going to use this? And I don't think that those are questions that manufacturers and designers want to take on. It's a lot of responsibility, a lot of extra like financial investment and time invested to make sure that there's full responsibility for what they're putting into their world. It's a lot easier to say, oh, past point of sale is not our worry. And so that was something that was really interesting to me in working in waste, was so many consumers really want to do the right thing. And they're looking for, where do I recycle this product, or how do I reuse this product? And when the answer is you can't, that's a design flaw. Like that's a manufacturer error. And so that's something that I think is a good way to start to shift how we shop and where we're buying from, and the responsibility and accountability that we give to the companies that are creating products we use.
It's just kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, right? As long as we're just complicit in this whole thing, as long as we accept that burden of ownership, and we don't demand that they make the end of life a part of how they design this thing.
In the end, too, it's really subsidized. We did some research into like New York City's. This was years ago, but I think the budget is probably similar. If you look at just the cost to pick up 6% of the trash and bring it to landfill, because that 6% was textiles, and that was what I was working on, the city was spending $60 million a year to dispose of textiles. And so that is where I think that's a manufacturer responsibility, because it becomes a taxpayer burden. The disposal that cities do becomes a taxpayer burden. And if we could recycle it instead, if it could be making the city money instead, because they could contribute to the feedstock for recycling, there's just so many more options, but manufacturers right now aren't required to think about those options.
Okay. All right. So this gets us to your business model, which is so cool. Okay. So first of all, just give us an overview of the problem. We don't spend a lot of time on the problem on this podcast. We're all about the solution. But give us an overview of how I had never knew that for every 1 pound of clothing waste that I personally produce, it takes 40 pounds of waste to get me that clothing. Talk to us about how this whole thing actually works from 100,000 foot look, and then you can tell us about your business model.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's one thing that we don't think about often, is how much waste businesses are creating. And so really what FABSCRAP is looking at, because I worked for years in the post-consumer textile recycling world, was that businesses are also creating the same waste in a different form. It's not used clothing. It's usually excess fabric, unused yarn, unused leather. Just there's excess everywhere throughout the chain of production. And so what FABSCRAP does is work with businesses and starting to hold businesses more accountable for the waste that they're creating in their offices. And we do that by providing a pickup of their unwanted materials, and then we sort it for recycling or reuse. And that is an option that they never had before, to do something a little bit more responsible and sustainable. But it also, the way that we're set up, hold them a little bit more accountable because it's a service that they pay for. So the same way that they pay to have their trash removed or have their paper recycled, they pay to have their textile waste responsibly handled. And they do that, I think, not required by law yet, but I think they do that because customers really want to know, how is this business being sustainable? And they want to have answers for that. And so I think there's, in the core of this, there's a lot of actual like individual power here that brands are listening to consumers, but we hold them accountable by making their waste part of their bottom line. And I think that's a really powerful place for them to start to bring in those costs and internalize the cost of their practices.
Yeah, this is a shift. So how it used to be was that manufacturer that was manufacturing clothing, they would just have all the cutout edges of fabric, or the fabric they decided not to use, or the over whatever they ordered that was over. They would just shove it in a dumpster, pay the normal trash pickup bill, and off it would go to some landfill somewhere. It's that simple, right? And that amounted to 6% of New York City's garbage.
So here's the other interesting thing. 6% of New York City's waste is textiles, but cities all across the country, our municipal waste numbers as a whole for the United States are only looking at what residential waste numbers. So like they're only looking at what individuals throw out. Businesses actually don't have to report their waste. They're not regulated in the same way. There's not the same accountability. And so it was something that I found really frustrating working at sanitation was I was trying to educate 7 million people in New York State what recycling laws they're supposed to answer, or they're supposed to follow, but businesses don't have the same laws. And that was really frustrating for me because they create so much more waste. Like you said, for every pound we throw away as an individual, the business throws away 40. So businesses are so much more responsible for the waste crisis, and they're not being held to the same standards that we are as individuals. And I thought that was a really important shift to start, like, make that public, that like, hey, if we're required to do these things, businesses should be required to do them too.
And now when I think about some cities, I have friends. Well, I live in Vermont, and it's very, very rural here. But I have friends who live in cities that tell me the stringent recycling processes that they have to go through are just really, really serious. And so I was just shocked to learn there was no regulation of business waste. And then textiles are so huge.
Yeah. And then,
so tell us about your business model.
So what we do is we pick up the fabric from brands. We're working with over 800 fashion companies now, mostly with their design office, and picking up excess material that's created during the design process. So like I said, unused cones of yarn, buttons, dippers, lots of yardage of usable, beautiful fabric, unused leather skin. We pick that up and it comes to our warehouses, and we're sorting it with volunteer help for either reuse or recycling. The best part is reuse, like when we can reuse something. And so we have 2 fabric thrift stores and 1 online store. And basically, it's a way to make this waste from an industry anonymous and accessible. So you can find this like beautiful discarded fabric from Marc Jacobs, Oscar de la Renta, J. Crew, Gap, Express. It's all available in our thrift stores, but it's anonymous. It's just FABSCRAP fabric at that point. It's thrift store prices, and it's all saved from landfill, which is great. So we're reusing as much as we can. It tends to be about 60%. And then inevitably there's pieces that are too small to reuse, or, and this is a growing issue, or they're proprietary. They've got logos and patterns on them that brands would not want resold. So if it's too small to use or proprietary, it gets shredded. And that's what we're calling recycling. It becomes insulation, carpet padding, mattress stuffing. It's no longer really identifiable as fabric, but it still has like a useful life. Those fibers are still put into circulation again.